Hey, we're just going to wait one more minute. We have about 75 people signed up and we're almost halfway there. So we're just going to give people a minute and then we'll start. Okay, we're getting there with registration. So we're going to, or I should say, with folks getting in. So we'll start. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Denise Savageau, and I'm the chair of the Connecticut Water Planning Council's Education and Outreach Work Group. And we work under the Water Planning Council Advisory Group, and we're a subgroup under them. Very excited for our workshop today. We've been holding a series of workshops, and the series this year is on extreme weather and our watershed, something very timely, particularly coming off of the year we had last year. We went from flooding to drought to wildfires, and that's going to be our topic today. So we're really excited about this. Just to let you know, and we'll put this in the chat, is that you can um, get a copy or see all of our past workshops. So this is the second in our series of workshops, but on our outreach and education work group website page, you can get to all of our past workshops. So we started out this series in March, kind of with an overview of the series. And today we're excited to bring you this topic on forest droughts and wildfires. Um, this is a timely topic. I think probably most folks thought we were never going to really talk about wildfires. Isn't that something that happens out west? A few years ago, we really weren't thinking about drought so much in Connecticut, but now we're looking at all that. And so, why would the Water Planning Council Advisory Group and the Water Planning Council be worried about forest droughts and wildfires? And it has to do with the relationship, obviously, between forests and our watersheds. The water we have, the amount of water we have, the water quality we have, all is dependent on a healthy watershed around that, and that's our forest. So we're really excited today to have Chris Martin with us. Chris is our state forester. He has been the DEP's forestry director since 2008. He's a licensed forester in Connecticut and Maine, as well as a member of the Society of American Foresters. Chris is active with the National Association of State Foresters, often weighing in on federal policy and budgets affecting Connecticut forests and programs offered by the Division of Forestry. And I know last year there was a tough fire season, and I happened to be at a meeting with Chris in November when we had the first rainfall that we'd had in months, and he did a little happy dance. So I am so excited to have Chris with us today. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, invite Chris to unmute himself, come on board, and he can do his screen. We'll just got remind people to stay on mute and off camera. And if you have questions, we can put them in the chat, as well as we'll be taking questions and asking people, a Q&A at the end. And maybe people can get off speaker at that time as well. So Chris, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Denise. And it is a real privilege for me to be here today, and to kind of share with you some things in Connecticut, both present and recent history. I do want to premise this talk with the fact that, and I'm convinced of this, Connecticut will always have an abundance of trees, will always have an abundance of people, and we'll always have the need for pure, clean drinking water, both surface and ground. And I want to reemphasize the first 2 points, forests and people. So we'll be talking about some things today that might get people like, oh my goodness, the world is coming to an end. And that's not the case. I want to assure you that's not the case. However, we do see impacts, and at times very severe impacts, that are occurring in Connecticut due to our changing climate. And so with that premise, I'm going to share my screen and cross my fingers everything goes as planned. So let's see how this goes here now. I'm hoping that works for everybody and you can see the opening slide.
Yes, that looks good, Chris.
Good. All right. Thanks for that confirmation. So extreme weather, our watersheds, forest drought, and wildfires. So just some forestry fun facts to kick us off. And this is on purpose because we need to recognize that we are a very small state relative to the nation, but yet we are a very populated state. And actually, the number of our greatest stakeholders here today, the private forest landowners, aren't that many, about 108,000. And these are folks with properties of 10 acres or more. But as you can see, the amount of people living in and amongst the forest is really very high. And what we do is a term that's called the wildland urban interface, or another term, woodland urban interface. And because of our population and the acreage of forest, we have some of the highest, and the acronym reads as WUI, W-U-I, one of the highest indexes in the country. Fourth most densely populated state, but also, again, to reemphasize, the 14th most forested state. And if anyone has ever taken a cross-country plane ride, looking out the window, once you pass Ohio, you can definitely see the difference in the landscape. And so as you go back to New England and fly over Connecticut, you really don't see anything but trees, maybe but for the central part of the state. And so I just finished the tree census, and I go around the state, I count all the trees, and there's 857 million trees. No, that's not true. Our USDA Forest Service does have a forest inventory and analysis program, and through spatial sensing and on the ground truthing with the limited plots, they do estimate that Connecticut has 857 trees. That equates to 246 trees per person. And where are those trees? Thanks to our friends at UConn, they a few years ago mapped out where the largest sections of forests are in Connecticut. And with their core forest analysis, this map depicts where our largest core forests are located and down to where our smallest core forests are located. That doesn't mean that the white areas, the light colored areas, contain no trees. In fact, some of our urban forests have some of the highest canopy ratings in the country also. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a desperate there because some of our most economically challenged neighborhoods in Connecticut have the least amount, or maybe no, urban tree canopy cover, and we're working to fix that. Our most common forest type in Connecticut, and this is all background to kind of fill in what we're going to be talking about in a few minutes, is what we call an oak hickory type, forest type. It doesn't necessarily mean that oak and hickory are the most prominent tree species in Connecticut, but there's a lot of tree species associated with this grouping. And in fact, the most common tree in Connecticut is red maple. But we do value, and particularly our wildlife friends do value the most, the actual oak and hickory tree species, as they are critical mast producers and a critical food source for our wildlife. In Connecticut, we are proud to say that we do work to keep our forests healthy. And this is purposeful intervention because of all the stressors that are on the forests. Uh, and but also some other interesting tidbits is that, you know, our urban tree canopy cover is some of the highest in the nation. There's 2 people per acre of forest. And again, just to reemphasize, and many people don't recognize this offhand, but the majority of woodland in Connecticut is not state and not federally owned. It's privately owned, and that really is an important thing to note, because the folks that have the most influence on Connecticut's ecosystem is not government. It is the folks who owns those property. And so our outreach and education, and in fact, the Soil and Water Conservation District's outreach and education to private landowners is absolutely essential to keeping forests as forests and keeping resilient forests in Connecticut. Again, re-emphasizing who owns these woods, and this is a breakdown of ownership of forest in Connecticut. And as I mentioned, and hopefully not surprisingly, the federal government has very little, 1%. Municipal land trusts, municipalities rather, 11%. The state, with its about 250,000 acres, represents 17%. And so again, Connecticut's woodland ownership is mostly held by private individuals. And we can thank the Connecticut's current use taxation program, more fondly known as PA 490, which allows folks to own forest land at an affordable price and not be overburdened by local taxes. We can credit that program to helping keep forests as forests, making forest ownership affordable in Connecticut. You know, shifting gears a little bit, and this may be totally rudimentary to most folks here, but there are 3 major ways healthy forests support our clean water. And this is illustrated here in this great World Resource Institute illustration where, you know, we can look on the hillsides and where water runs downhill. So typically our watersheds are on the upland areas leading to our surface supply water reservoirs downstream at a lower elevation. So those forest canopies, they are critical to regulating release of precipitation. And so they not only capture it, but they store it and slowly release it. And we do all know here that, you know, fast moving water, regardless of the cover type that is running over, will eventually cause erosion. And so having healthy tree canopy covers to disperse that energy and store it in the groundwater and let it leachate through the surface layers to lower elevation streams and brooks and eventually to our reservoirs is actually essential. And it acts as a natural filter. Forests filter the pollution out of the water. They hold the naturally occurring metals in place and nutrients and minerals, and those are uptaked by the trees. Some of the pollutants are bioaccumulated by trees, and other things are retained in the soil. And so what actually reaches the surface water is very clean and very healthy. Now I can advance my slide, hopefully. Here we go. This is I wanted to share this tool, and some folks may be aware of this already, but this is a USDA online tool. It's the Forest to Faucets Data Explorer. And I highlighted Connecticut's watersheds in it. It illustrates the very important fact that Connecticut's forests are essential to the quality of both our surface water and our groundwater in Connecticut. And on the right side of the screen, there's an importance index. And as you can see, the darkest color is the highest index rating. And if those familiar with Connecticut water utilities, you can see the Aquarion watershed, you can see New Haven, you can see MDC, Barkhamsted there, and some of our eastern water supplies. But even so, the Housatonic River Basin, very highly graded, important. And then in eastern Connecticut, I think more so because of the lower population, the colors are a little bit lighter. But this important index, the formula here I'll share, really is emphasizes that these watersheds are serving thousands upon thousands of people on a daily basis, both from their surface water supply, but then also from their groundwater supply, which isn't emphasized here, but is shown and taken into consideration. So again, the highlight here is that this is a real thing. People's lives depend on clean drinking water, and thankfully to our Department of Public Health, we have some of the most stringent regulations on drinking water watersheds in the nation, where point source discharge is prohibited. Not the case in other states. And so that helps us with the purity, helps us with assurance of safety, and also, frankly, reduces treatment costs, which affects every ratepayer in Connecticut. Some drinking water facts. 76% of Connecticut's population is tied into a public water system. And 21% of the large systems in Connecticut rely exclusively on surface reservoir supplies. And then the remainder of the folks, they're looking at their own private drinking water wells, which we should not underemphasize the importance of those private drinking water wells. And of course, what's most dear to my heart is, the recognition that when you want to safeguard drinking water and you're trying to determine what the most compatible use is, there is nothing better than keeping the forest as forest to safeguard that drinking water supply. Wanted to shift gears a little bit here and speak about the role of forest management and fire, because on our landscape historically, fire was a fairly common thing. There's evidence-based information that indigenous populations often used fire to maintain desirable understory conditions for hunting, that it was used to help clear areas for cultivation, and that over time our forests developed to be an oak hickory dominant forest, those mass producing trees, because of the frequency of low intensity fire. And we try to mimic that within DEEP to a much smaller scale, obviously, on an annual basis through our prescribed fire program. And so the next couple of pictures kind of depict that prescribed fire program, which is really primarily focused on our wildlife management areas to enhance warm season grasses for some of our most imperiled bird species in Connecticut that depend on that habitat, which, as Connecticut is mostly forested, our latent agricultural lands, our meadows, our fields, that's a very minor component of Connecticut's landscape. And so maintaining grasslands in Connecticut is essential. Also, as depicted on the left side of the picture, we do set the woods on fire. And that may be alarming to some, but it is under a special permit issued by the commissioner in coordination with our Air Bureau and in coordination with our parks folks, because there are several things that need to line up perfectly in order for us to ignite, as you see on the left. And that includes proper personnel, adherence to a burn plan, which has specific air temperature, relative humidity criteria, and most importantly, wind criteria. And then also the Air Bureau, making sure we have enough lift, the air quality is acceptable so that we have conditions that will lift the smoke up high into the atmosphere and not impact anybody on the ground. And here's another picture of folks kind of lighting the grass on fire. We did quite a bit at the Suffield Wildlife Management Area this summer, or rather this spring, and to much success. What happens with these fields when they're not cultivated or mowed on a regular basis? We do see an increased frequency of invasive plants, autumn olive, Japanese knotweeds, another concern, barberry, and all those bad players. Lighting these areas on fire periodically, once every 5 years, really arrests the spread of those invasive plants and restores kind of the more natural ecosystem that were desirable. In the woods, we're looking to create ideal conditions for acorn release, pitch pine cone release, which you'll see some pitch pine in the background here, which is another imperiled ecosystem in Connecticut that is fire dependent. Pitch pine have a serotinous cone that releases when heated. And so these low-grade fires, as they work through the forest floor, they not only knock back invasive plants, but also release these pitch pine cones, the seeds within the pitch pine cones. And we get the desirable regeneration that we're looking for. Out competing, what we do see is our most common tree these days, red maple. And I'll say that black birch is a close second behind that. Both of those trees don't do well with periodic burning. The oak does very well. The hickory, thicker barked trees are just fine. We're also seeing an increased interest in this type of activity by land trusts in Connecticut. Norcross, just over the line in Massachusetts this past spring, did their very first prescribed fire. And we saw Joshua's Land Trust follow suit on some of their properties. So this is a growing thing of interest amongst the landscaped community within Connecticut. We do, caution folks that make sure that they are fully equipped. They've had some training. And as we gather capacity in Connecticut, I think we'll see more of this. These types of fires at the local level by land trusts have to be authorized by the local burn official. And it is questionable how many local burn officials are familiar with prescribed fire. Mostly folks are familiar with burning, a pile of brush in their backyard. But there is, again, growing interest in this and a growing frequency. Yale, in the Eastford area, has been doing these for quite a few years. And some of the results of prescribed low-intensity fire with the right conditions, you don't kill the trees in the upper canopy, but you do gain some control of what's growing in the lower canopy. And oftentimes, you can knock back severely the invasive plant species that are coming in. Oops, let me go back. And here's a great picture of what good fire can result in, a restored meadow area with lots of natural plants flourishing right after the fire. This is one growing season, what you see that pop out in the lower right. And then, the more advanced growth you see in the background of the picture, it's probably maybe 2 or 3 years old. So shifting gears again a little bit to some of the bad things that can happen. And the picture on the right here of this tree looking like it's standing on stilts, if you can see where the bark starts and the burn mark begins below that. So that line at one time was the top of the ground. That's where the soil was. And so what happened here was we had a ground fire and about 1.5 feet, maybe 2 feet of soil or peat burned and is no longer there. We saw this very evident in the Cornwall Flat Rocks fire in 2016, where 2 feet of topsoil between September and December burnt away, and trees were left on stilts. The land was highly erodible, and it was like walking on grease, and trees were toppling over because all their roots were completely exposed. So ground fires in Connecticut, these are the ones that happen in the fall that are sometimes go deep into the ground that are basically impossible to put out. But going to more recent events, and the irony here cannot be overstated, where we had what they call the water bomb occur in the Oxford Southbury area. This is the area of Connecticut where I grew up, frankly. 12 inches of rain, less than 24 hours. Route 67, Oxford, unrecognizable. Punk Up Road, Lathrop Road, Coppermine area, unrecognizable. I was just over that way a couple of months ago. And then that same location, some of our most troublesome ground fires were occurring a month later. So we went from a foot of rain in 24 hours to the driest 2-month period on record in Connecticut's history, September and October. That's what you call weather extremes. And we saw things starting to become unraveled early October. We were starting to get an uptick in wildfires, no precipitation in the foreseeable future. And then things really kicked up on October 21st. That was shortly followed after by the governor's declared civil preparedness of emergency when the Hawthorne fire started in Berlin, Connecticut. Between October, the 30-day period, October 20th to November 20th, over 200 fires, 220 wildfire starts throughout the state. That's unheard of. Thankfully, by the time all that started happening, we had brought in a lot of additional resources into Connecticut. We weren't the only ones under this severe drought. And it's kind of fun. Well, not funny, but the drought was being, right at the earliest stages, actually. As far as drought monitoring and groundwater levels, we went into this, actually, the groundwater levels were pretty good. But the faucet shut off, and it shut off for a long, long time. We had support from Air National Guard, first time in 30 years. We had crews from Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, folks from California, South Carolina. The New England states, is what they could spare, came to Connecticut to help us. There was amazing response from municipal fire departments and the DEMIS, our Department of Homeland Emergency Services, those regional coordinators on the ground 24/7, assisting, coordinating out of the EOC, the Emergency Operations Center in Hartford. Just remarkable. Our neighbors in Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, during this time period, had massive wildfires, 1,000-acre plus fires, individual fires. Connecticut, we were very, very fortunate. The 127-acre fire in Berlin, the Lamentation Mountain, otherwise known as the Hawthorne fire. East Lyme area, 40-acre fire, but the vast majority of the other fires, 5 acres and less. And it was because of our municipal capacity, everyone leaning forward, the resources we brought in from out of state, mostly through the Northeast Forest Fire Compact, which is a Eastern province, Canadian province, New England, New York compact that we are a member of, helped us through some of our most challenging times. Connecticut applied for, and we're still receiving information for the very first FEMA-funded fire management assistance grant. And that is a grant that is offered to states when certain thresholds are met. And we met that threshold with the Hawthorne fire in Berlin with a daily cost of over $20,000, $30,000 with the Air National Guard support and Maine Forest Service air support. And we are gathering that information. We'll be submitting that information to FEMA come August. And the best thing is that it's a 75-25. So we get a 75% reimbursement for allowable costs, which is going to be in the several million dollars. The wildfire stats from 2024, really, when you look at them, they don't really stand out as highly unusual or way off the charts. 605 fires, 510 acres impacted, no big deal, you would think. However, because of our wildland urban interface, there were many residences threatened, severely threatened by oncoming wildfires. And to the point where in Berlin, the Berlin Fire Department basically set up a sprinkler system over a neighborhood as the Hawthorne fire creeped down the mountain, which is also a very unusual fire behavior. Very unfortunate. As most people know, there was one fatality. A Wethersfield fireman lost his life on Lamentation Mountain. And then there are other, much less, but nevertheless not insignificant injuries to firefighters. And so this was highly impactful, highly intense, highly, I would say, concentrated to this October-November time period. 30 days, just 30 days. Picture of the Lamentation Mountain fire. And this picture really does illustrate this woolly landscape that we have in Connecticut, where we're all, I like to say, forest dwellers. We live in and amongst the forest. There's no denying it. You can't look out a window without seeing a tree in Connecticut. And so when things bad happen in the forest, it can impact us pretty quickly. And you can see some of the smoke, excuse me, from this fire right behind the solar panels of this house, nestled, quaintly in the woods. Thankfully, this house survived the fire. It was fine, but if it were not for the firemen, you can see their trucks at the end of the driveway, it could have been a definitely different result. The fire, really cranked up quickly. We had just finished updating our standard operating procedure for the Forest Protection Program in March of 2024. And here we were, as prepared as we could be, 6 months later. This is a picture of the Maine Forest Service. We're dipping water out of Silver Lake. These folks were phenomenal. Their rotation on dipping and dumping was probably less than 10 minutes. Just remarkable, the amount of water that was dropped on this fire. And the ground, you can't see the ground below that, but that is essentially trees growing on top of a boulder field, which was just treacherous ground to try to get in and amongst those boulders to put that fire out. This is a nighttime aerial heat image showing the Hawthorne fire creeping down the mountain towards the neighborhood. And folks familiar with fire, fire burns uphill. Fire is not supposed to burn downhill. But no, not the case here. And this was not a wind-driven downhill ascent. It was a fuel-driven, dry fuel-driven downhill ascent that this fire behavior occurred at. A picture across the lake, just pretty dramatic. You can see two sections of fire, the main section burning the perimeter, and then there's another section over to the left there. A campfire, unattended campfire. That was the cause. Nothing malicious, nothing intentional, but the impact, nevertheless, significant. Shifting gears a little bit now, because we do have other things occurring in our forests besides fire. And again, I'm going to reemphasize that we'll always have trees, we'll always have people, we'll always need the water. But yet we do see these intense events occurring on a very localized basis that can have huge impacts. This is a picture of Easton Reservoir in Fairfield County, Easton, Connecticut. You can see the line there is Route 58 going up towards Aspetuck. And this is a pine stand in Fairfield that just got flattened from Hurricane Sandy. It was a very mature pine stand that, was heavily stocked. Maybe could have been thinned out a little bit beforehand, but nevertheless, Superstorm Sandy poked a hole in that one section of the stand, and the wind worked, and before you knew it, excuse me, the whole stand was knocked down. So it's just, when you lose a good neighbor, the whole neighborhood is impacted. And here we have these trees standing side by side, holding each other up, bracing the wind. But when one let go, it was a huge domino effect. And, we could talk about the wildfire risk, insect disease risk that can occur from just so much down woody debris. But, thankfully, we were able to find a logging contractor, not only reduce the cost of the cleanup, so it was basically a net zero, but reduce the fuel, reduce the insect disease issues, and then created a ground floor, a forest floor, basically, for regeneration. And although this area is not currently covered in pine trees, it has successfully regenerated to a young forest. And, the critters that used to like the pine forest no longer there, but the critters that like to live in a young hardwood forest find it very attractive. 2018, we saw a derecho event, a microburst, cut across Connecticut, kind of started in Brookfield and worked its way across the state. This was an area. Brookfield is a beautiful town, many mature trees, lots and lots of houses underneath those trees. And so when you have a wind event like this, unlike the derechos in the Midwest, in the big agricultural states, the impact is multiple times higher. And lots of concern for the residents here when this occurred. Police, fire could not get to people's homes, and so the simple fact of delivering medication, whether it's from the pharmacy or to someone's post office box, mailbox, it was impossible. And so we had sent crews there to help just basically bulldoze the roads out, just get some type of access so people can get in and people can get out, and they wouldn't have to relocate. Not that they could relocate, they couldn't go anywhere. This same event basically wiped out the day use area of Sleeping Giant State Park. This is was and what is now, thankfully, after considerable restoration, but it was a bucolic white pine stand with picnic tables scattered throughout. Very, very popular, just beautiful area to go with the family and enjoy a hot summer afternoon in amongst the shade of the trees. And in all one fell swoop, it was gone. Got into the trail system there. Couldn't access the tower at Sleeping Giant. Today, though, and I wish I had a picture of it, very nicely landscaped, restored. The access buildings restored. The park fills up regularly on weekends, and so there is recovery after these things, but the initial shock is considerable. Shifting a little bit now to some of our indigenous, or not so much indigenous, but some of our non-weather related concerns we have, which can be caused by weather to some extent, is our forest pest issues. And this is a aerial survey provided by the Connecticut Agriculture Experiment Station. They fly the state end of summer each year, and they map out different forest health concerns in Connecticut. And this is 2024, which actually is a pretty good year. 2024 was a pretty good year for insect and disease outbreaks. And you can see the most common bad players in Connecticut, so to speak. Beech leaf disease, probably our newest addition to forest health concerns in Connecticut. Spongy moth, formerly known as gypsy moth, really hit hard Eastern Connecticut in 2016, 2019. Moved over to Northwestern Connecticut more recently, but the last couple of years, and this year in particular, not so much so, but the damage had already been done. Brought about by spring droughts, where the caterpillar flourishes and the naturally occurring soil fungus does not. Need wet soil conditions to activate the fungus that kills the spongy moth. And what also is not shown here, and thankfully it's a minor component now, but we do see it comes from Long Island and Louisiana. It is the southern pine beetle that has migrated northward. Southern pine beetle, a big concern in southern states and the pine plantations down there, and the longleaf pine, naturally occurring pine. Had been in New Jersey for several years, hopped over to Long Island, right around Superstorm Sandy, and then got blown up to Long Island, across the Long Island Sound into southern Connecticut. Stays at very low levels, but that pine beetle, southern pine beetle, attacks hard pines, which is pitch pine, which I mentioned earlier, a very endangered tree in Connecticut, endangered ecosystem. Loves pitch pine, so we're concerned about that. Watching that, thankfully, it's being held at bay the current winter conditions. But these are the things that we watch for and impact our forests, our natural forests. Let's see. All of these are introduced pests. None of these are native to the Northeast. Kind of a consequence of our global economy. Beech leaf disease, still a lot of research on, but that is spread, they're likely thinking, by migratory birds, of all things, right? So highlighting the gypsy moth issue, and for folks familiar with Housatonic State Forest in Sharon and Cornwall area, you're seeing a lot of activity up there on the Housatonic State Forest. We're working very closely with Sharon Audubon and the Agricultural Experiment Station on basically rebuilding that forest. The amount of mortality of the oak is overwhelming. We really can't let people in there, not only for hiking, but for recreational hunting. The overhead risk is just too excessive. And so we are salvaging the dead oak trees there. We are treating the understory because once you have that much sunlight hitting the forest floor, the invasive plants that might be minimal flourish and need to be kept at check. And reducing, future wildfire risk by removing those larger fuels and actually adding, forest products to the local economy. Some folks don't like the idea of cutting trees in Connecticut for forest products. But the truth be told, we all use forest products, whether we're sitting on it currently, as in a wooden chair, wiping our countertops off with a paper towel or what have you. And so, as we think locally and act globally, we all need to contribute to the forest products chain. And one way to do that is to source wood responsibly, but also locally. And that's kind of the highlights that I wanted to share with everybody. And I wanted to leave plenty of time for any questions or follow up on any things I may have presented. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Chris. And I'm going to ask the first question, and then if folks want to either raise their hand or put questions in the chat, that would be great. But I wanted to start with the resources you talked about, and I know that emergency preparedness plans and this urban wildfire interface, that we have these compacts across boundaries, but we're looking at real changes right now, and we've had a lot of retirements in the U.S. Forest Service. We're seeing impacts in states. So just if you could talk a little bit about the reality of us continuing to manage it. It's one thing to do it for one season and we had all this help, but could you talk a little bit about the resources needed and how sustainable that is and what we might need to do to make sure that we are resilient in this way?
Yeah, certainly. And Denise, you set me up well. So this past fall was a real stress test. I mentioned we had updated the standard operating procedures, so we knew what to do when we knew our trigger points, and we activated according to plan. But we had never really activated the plan. so when it all came together, we kind of sat back and said, "Wow, this is actually working." One of our challenges was, you look to your closest resources, right? And so we looked to Rhode Island, we looked at Massachusetts, we looked to New York, and they're looking back at us and saying, we're not sending any help. We got our own problems, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because when you have a drought, rarely is it like, again, Connecticut's a relatively small state. It's a regional drought. And so they're dealing with their own concerns. And so thankfully, the Northeast Compact came in and we were able to bring in resources from out of state. And frankly, from Oregon was our farthest away resource. But to this point where we are now seeing a huge workforce reduction, federal workforce reduction, we don't know exactly what the outcome is going to be. And so, heaven forbid, we are faced with another October 2024 and 2025. There's a lot of uncertainty, Denise. We do know that the federal government has put a cap on the amount of wildfire. These are frontline people, wildfire fighters that will not be allowed to take the early retirement incentives. But we also know that the folks that did take the early retirement, many of them were in the longer toothed career folks. And so they had the most ground experience. They were in leadership positions in your incident command system. Those were the team managers that manage hundreds of people on an incident. There's a loss of capacity there. At the same point, though, we are conducting several after-action reviews, after-action evaluations with municipal fire departments, within our own team, deep, to sit back and say, okay, what went well, what didn't go so well, where are our training needs? The SWOT analysis, right? The strength, weakness, opportunity, threats. And we're in the process of mapping that out. Our Demis folks have hired a contractor to help facilitate a statewide review of this, and we're hoping to get a pretty robust report and some guidance on how we can do even better next time and be as prepared, if not better prepared next time.
Thanks, Chris. And of course, emergency response is one side of it. The other thing is being prepared and having healthy forests. And we have a question, because I know part of having a healthy forest is what you talked about was the controlled burns. So we have a question in the chat that says, what time of year do you conduct the controlled burns? Excuse me, something just jumped up here. So what time of year do you conduct the control burns? And do you have a schedule of areas that you have identified as needing controlled burns?
So typically, the most of our controlled burns are done in the spring, prior to green up, during the time of year where we have our brush fires, frankly. And so some of our best controlled burns are on high fire danger days, which is okay. Now you're looking at me cross-eyed, right? Why are you starting a fire when it's a high risk day? Well, again, the fires that we do are under very specific conditions. And so it may be a high fire danger day, but there's basically no wind. It may be a high fire danger day, but we got 30 people out there with lots of fire engines and control lines pre put in place. And so the best time to burn is when the fuel is going to be dry and accessible. Alternatively, though, for folks that want to look at this, spring is a good time shortly after a rain, when the fuels aren't that accessible, but on a smaller scale, you can actively push fire, start a fire, and keep it small and contained with proper training. There's another time of year in the fall that is similar, where you don't have a lot of green understory, which is full of moisture. You need dead, dry understory to start the fire.
And just quickly, as a follow-up, do you have areas that you've identified, or is it statewide? So it's all forests. Do you have?
Yeah, we do have a rotating priority. We schedule about maybe 8 different prescribed burns each spring that may bleed into the fall. Capacity concerns, we're very ambitious, right? So we schedule 8, we may get 6 done. They are focused on wildlife management areas, where we're going to retain that warm season grass, and we're seeing an influx of invasive plants or woody plants overtaking that habitat. In the forested areas, those may be larger fires, but lower intensity fires, where we're just trying to knock back invasive plants and create understory conducive for oak and hickory regeneration.
Thanks. So next question, and this is an interesting one. So, is any thought being given to using beavers to keep the forest moist to resist fire? So it's like, do you use beavers in forest management? Just a question, I guess.
Yeah, well, that is a good question. The beavers used to be, I think, a lot more prominent and have a lot more control over Connecticut's landscape pre-colonial settlement. And when we can keep beavers on the landscape, they are welcome. Unfortunately, because of again, we're going back to the wooey thing, right? Beavers can cause concern. They can flood people's yards, take out roads. But when we can, at least on state lands, we welcome beavers. We don't try to destroy their dams unless some type of critical downstream, like people's homes, are in danger because of all the backed up water.
Yeah, it's always a balance, but it looks like one of those nature-based solutions.
Right.
Okay, so we just have a couple more questions in the chat that I think we can get to. I think we still have time. Is there data of the connection between forest coverage and Connecticut's water resources? And for example, the percentage of private forests are connected to groundwater resources?
That data, so that Forest to Faucets that website, although surface water focus, does have, I believe, groundwater background to it. So that is a source of data. And that was a fancy map I showed, right? But that is a GIS-based map that's full of metadata that feeds the colors on the map. Also, the American Waterworks Association a few years back did a study. It was a multi-barrier approach to source water protection. And it did talk about the acreage of forest and the relative cost of filtration, tertiary filtration, um, as opposed to secondary, which is not New York City is secondary because they have such a large forested watershed. They did a cost analysis and did basically there's a direct ratio proportion on cost of potable water the percent of watershed coverage. And I don't have that study handy by, but I think if you Googled it, Source Water Protection, American Water Works Association, multi-barrier approach, those keywords, it's probably 15 years old now, that study.
Okay, thanks. And I'm putting in the chat just as part of that, is that the Connecticut Council on Soil and Water Conservation, working with the Department of Public Health, this was their brainchild project, and Yukon Clear. We have a Yukon source water protection site, and it looks at all that land use analysis, and it looks at forest cover. What are the best properties, for example, to protect for drinking water and whatever. The idea of that project was to look at what lands we needed to protect our drinking water, and it did get into forest cover, so as well as soils and a whole host of other things. So put that in there. And then let's say we had one more question that I saw, and then we'll open it up if anybody has it raised hands. I think we'll have time for one more. But the last one I have is and this is from Allie. She said, and she's running the show. So just thank you to Allie Hibbert, who's been running all the letting people in the room and being the host and making sure we're online and whatever. She says, is there do we know how the Hawthorne fire started? Is there a theory, or do we know how that fire started? And she apologized if she missed it while she was operating everything for us.
No, that's fine. And hats off to you, Allie. You are doing multiple things. So we are very certain there was an unauthorized campsite on Lamentation Mountain, and that campsite had a fire pit, and we're fairly certain that someone was there, and we're also fairly certain it wasn't intentional. But they were camping there. They left the fire. They didn't put their smoky on, right? And put your hand over the fire, feel it's cool to the touch, douse it with water. Somewhere that best management practice didn't get fully carried out. And that was the source of the 127-acre fire that unfortunately claimed to life.
Thanks. I'm just going to open up. Is there any other questions? If people want to raise their hand, they don't have to put them in the chat. Some people prefer asking questions. I'm not seeing any. So I'm just going to turn it over to you, Chris, for if you have anything that you think you missed, or you will, that anything sparked that you wanted just reemphasize.
Well, again, there's a lot of bad pictures I showed to make a point. And I'll reemphasize that Connecticut forests over time have proven to be resilient. We have some of the best soils, some of the best growing conditions in the country, some of the best fall foliage, right? I couldn't let that go. But and that's based upon diversity, right? So the more diverse your forest is, the more resilient your forest is going to be. And I'm also, tip my hat to our recent infusion of federal funding, which we're partnered up with the Soil and Water Conservation District. Denise, thank you, to implement some on-the-ground practices in Connecticut to stem the tide of our deteriorating forest health, mostly brought about by invasive plants, these exotic insects and diseases. Maintaining that multi-age, multi-layered canopy in our forests increases the resiliency. And we have benefited from staff that are within the Division of Forestry that were very aggressive pursuing the recent Inflation Reduction Act funds. We received a very nice award from the Forest Service. We're in the process of implementing that, getting that contracts in place. And there's more to come. There's more to come on this. We want to be able to empower folks to love their forests, care for their forests. And it all starts with them paying attention to their forests. So.
Okay, and we have one last question that popped up in the chat, and we still have time, so I'm going to give that to you. There are many private woodland owners who wish to implement controlled burns, but the administrative burden for doing so is often resource prohibitive. Has there been any consideration to developing a streamlined approach that reduces the barrier to entry for control burns as a forest management practice for private landowners?
So that's a great question, and I'm going to say, in all transparency, not really. Although I think that the tide is turning on this, where we are seeing land trusts taking a stronger interest in this, willing to touch their properties, and start acting on some of the challenges that they face. I think one of our, and we're this is on us to educate, and others maybe, but our open burn officials, uh, again, they're kind of used to like the brush pile in the backyard, right? And do you have a water source? Are you 100 feet from a woodland? The criteria for open burning in Connecticut is does not match what a prescribed fire is, which can oftentimes be in the woods, in the right conditions, of course. And so there's an educational component here that needs to take place. Uh, I think some of this after action review that I mentioned earlier is going to help reveal that. And so, we as a division of forestry, we can say all the things that people should be doing every day, to we're long in the tooth, and we don't always get, the response or the attention or the credibility that I think we deserve. But when other folks start asking the same questions and want to do the same things, then we get some leverage and we get some momentum. And so I think as time goes on here, people see fire as a good thing under controlled circumstances. We will see a more educated open burn official community, and broader acceptance.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thanks for everything you did for this program. It was amazing. As we wrap up, I just want to remind people that this is part of a series. We had 2 workshops this spring, one in March and this one. And then in the fall, we're planning 2 more, which we're going to be talking about forestry again, probably, because we've got 2 workshops coming up. One is going to be looking at extreme weather from the flooding perspective and how flood impacts water quality. And then we're going to be looking at drought and looking at, we always, we figure out like drought, we know water quantity is impacted, but how does drought impact water quality? So we're going to be putting 2 workshops on in the fall, one in late September and one in mid-October. Stay tuned for that. We're working out the details, and you can find that information when it's ready on that website that we showed. And again, we'll be posting this workshop on our website shortly, and as soon as we get it ready. So be sure to check out the outreach and education subgroups webpage that we put on the site and look at all of our other workshops we've had. Thanks again to Chris and to everyone who helped put this on. And have a good day, everyone.